All righty. So, as Declan mentioned, in a former life, before I chose the oh-so-very noble calling of writing business books, I worked in the equally noble calling of writing speeches for politicians. And because of that experience as a political speechwriter, people often ask me, Dan, what makes a good speech? And I've thought about that question a lot over the last 10 years, which is my new marker for everything. And I have discovered that good speeches in general, and good speeches on Friday afternoons at 5 p.m. on the heels of 2 full days in particular, always have 3 key ingredients, 3 key elements in any good speech, anywhere, anytime, any country, any language, any topic. 3 essential ingredients. They are brevity, levity, and repetition. Let me say that again. Brevity, levity, and repetition. So I'm going to try to be reasonably brief. I'm going to try not to be too severe and serious about it all. And I'm going to try to repeat the important stuff over and 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 over again until you want to scream. Now, here's what I want to do during our relatively short time together. It's a nice kind of compliment, I think, to Richard's presentation. What I want to do is I want to talk about success in a more kind of economic way. I want to make an argument to you about the economy and about how the traits that Richard was talking about are really habits of the heart. I think they make perfect sense to me. What I want to talk to you about is sort of into what spheres should you deploy these habits of the heart, and make an argument to you about how the abilities, the skills, not the habits of the heart, but the abilities, the capabilities, the cognitive capacities that used to matter the most still matter but matter less, and a different set of abilities matters more. So I want to make to you a big picture contextual argument about what's going on in the economies of most of the Western countries, certainly Japan, certainly Australia. And I want to begin by telling you about the biggest mistake I ever made. I want to sort of get into this economic argument by telling you about the biggest mistake I ever made. And that occurred roughly 20 plus years ago when, in a moment of youthful indiscretion, I decided to go to law school. Now, in the United States, law school is a professional school. You go to university and then you go on to graduate school, in my case, to study law. And in the United States, we have this very peculiar institution of class rank. That is, we look at people's marks and we stack them up. So you can be in the top 5% of your class. I wasn't there. Top 10% of your class. Wasn't there. Top 20% of your class. Wasn't there. I actually ended up graduating in the part of my law school class that made the top 90% possible. Now, it turned out, happily enough for me, as someone who ended up spending part of his professional life looking at the link between educational attainment and performance in labor markets, it turned out, ironically enough, that law school, more than anything I've done in my life, dramatically, profoundly, I would argue, permanently increased my earning power. Because in law school, I met my wife. Otherwise, it was a total loss. I really was. I graduated massively in debt thanks to the peculiar way we finance higher education in the U.S. I never practiced law a day in my life. If I could press the rewind button, live that part of my life over again, I would in a flash. All of which raises a question, which I think because it's the end of 2 long days, I will toss out to you, which is this. If it was such a colossal error, if I'm up here saying that this was the biggest mistake I ever made, what do you think the forces were impelling me to do that in the first place? What do you think was driving me to do that in the first place? What do you just shout out an answer? Expectations. Who else has an answer? Say that again. Acceptance. Somebody in the middle is shouting out your mother, and I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt that he's answering the question. And if he is, he's half right. Yes. That's what I thought at first. Like most things in life, this colossal mistake was really my parents' fault. I say that actually as a son and as a father. But actually, the more I spend my time studying organizations, studying people at work, the more one realizes the power of context, that we don't make decisions, we don't carry out behaviors in a vacuum. We do it in a context. We do it in the context of, in some ways, our own personal narrative. We do it in the context of the organization in which we work. We do it in the context of our nationality. We do it in the context of the historical moment that we inhabit. And when I was a kid, and just to lay out the context, I grew up in a middle-class family. I was explaining to someone at lunch today, he said, oh, I'm not that well-versed in U.S. geography. And I said, well, you know that there's New York and Washington and Miami on one side, and San Francisco and Los Angeles on the other side. And then there's this whole part that people fly over. That's where I'm from. I'm, in fact, from a town that there's no way you would have heard of, a town called Columbus, Ohio. Which, again, the best way to... When I was growing up, Columbus, Ohio was an absolute hotbed of social rest. It was the most kind of quintessentially kind of middle-class, middle-brow place that you can imagine. And that's the context. And I want to sort of talk about that context, because in that sort of context, talking basically the final third of the 20th century in advanced economies, the context that I grew up in was very much the context of all advanced economies. And the context yielded a certain recipe, certain formula of parental advice. And the advice went like this. Get good marks at school, go to university if you could, and then pursue a profession that's going to give you some amount of economic security. So if you're a kid like me and you're pretty good at English, maybe you go on and study law. If you're better at maths and the hard sciences, maybe you go become an engineer, maybe you go to medical school. If, blood grosses you out, your verbal skills are a little shaky, you could always go back in that era and become an accountant. And if you think about those kinds of professions here for a moment, the engineers, lawyers, accountants, it was those kind of professions. If you made it into one of those professions, you had a very solid foothold in the middle class. Not only in the US, not only in the UK, but basically throughout Western Europe, in Japan and in Australia, in the entire advanced economies. And if you take two steps back, and think about any kind of profession, any kind of industry. It was those sorts of abilities, those lawyer, engineer, accountant kind of abilities that mattered most. Those were the abilities that organizations wanted. Therefore, individuals were incentivized to develop those abilities. And we had this whole apparatus, this very elaborate apparatus, starting in, pre-primary school, from primary school to secondary school, into university, into professional schools, into firms themselves, to try to inculcate those kinds of abilities, those lawyer, accountant, engineer abilities. Well, my argument here today is that those kinds of abilities still matter, absolutely, but they matter less. And a different set of abilities matters more. And it's a set of abilities that, in many advanced economies, we haven't taken seriously enough. And here's how I want to explain it. This is where it's helpful to be a writer. I'm a writer, and if you ever want to annoy a writer, one of the best ways to annoy a writer, or one of the best ways to annoy me at least, is to tell a writer that a picture is worth 1,000 words. I hate that. I hate that. I mean, it's not wrong, it is irritating. But I would argue that good writers, good entrepreneurs, understand that, yes, a picture is sometimes worth 1,000 words. A picture is worth 1,000 words, but sometimes a metaphor is worth 1,000 pictures. A picture is worth 1,000 words, but sometimes a metaphor is worth 1,000 pictures. You are so profoundly less moved by that than I was when I came up with it, but that's all right. And I think there's a metaphor. If you think about all the sort of the things going on in this is about globalization. If you think about all the things going on in the global economy, if you think about all the things going on in labor markets around the world, I think there's a metaphor that helps us really clarify and understand what's going on in that space. And that metaphor is our brains. Our brains, as all of you know, are divided in half. You've got your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. Now, no doubt you've heard about left brain and right brain over the years, and unfortunately, much of what you've heard is crap, garbage, rubbish. This is one of those ideas where the popularization of the idea has gotten way ahead of the science, way ahead of the science. The number of insipid, vacuous, just plain wrong things that have been written about left brain and right brain over the years is just phenomenal. But in the last several years, thanks to functional magnetic resonance imaging, some of the machines that Helen was talking about yesterday, we're actually able to look into our brains and get a little glimmer of how they work. At this point, it's pretty primitive. We don't, our brains are very complicated and very complex. But what we have discovered is that at a kind of topographical level, our brains are also very elegant and efficient. Over time, they've done this really nice job of dividing up tasks. They have different specialties. But actually, in my book, A Whole New Mind, to make sure that I got the science right, I'm the son of a scientist. I care about science. I wanted to make, if I'm going to use this metaphor, I wanted to make sure I got the underlying science right. So in this book, A Whole New Mind, I went to the National Institutes of Health in Washington, D.C., U.S. National Institutes of Health in Washington, D.C., to get my own brain scanned, to see my own brain in action, which was so profoundly disappointing, I can't even describe it, but that's another story. And what we know about our brains is this. Our brains are very complicated. We use both sides of our brain for everything that we do. But at a broad topographical level, our brains are also very elegant and very efficient. Over time, they've done this spectacular job of dividing up tasks. They have different specialties. This side specializes in one set of tasks, tasks that are logical, linear, sequential, analytical. This side specializes in another set of tasks. Not better, not worse, not harder, not easier. It's just a different department. It specializes in tasks that are about processing things all at once rather than in sequence, tasks that are about synthesis rather than analysis, and tasks that are about understanding the context of a situation rather than the text. All right? And I think that division of labor in our brains yields a very powerful metaphor for understanding what's going on in economies, in labor markets, and businesses today. And here's how the metaphor works. It used to be that the most important abilities in any sort of endeavor, any kind of professional endeavor, were characteristic of the left hemisphere. The abilities that mattered most, the abilities that employers wanted, the abilities that individuals were incentivized to develop, were characteristic of the left hemisphere. The logical, linear, sequential, spreadsheet, zero in on the right answer abilities. And today, I really want to underscore this. Those kinds of abilities, those metaphoric left brain abilities, the logical, linear, sequential, analytical, step-by-step, zero in on the right answer abilities, are absolutely 100% necessary. Absolutely 100% necessary. Absolutely 100% necessary. But they're no longer sufficient. And now its abilities characteristic of this hemisphere of the brain. Again, it's a metaphor. Characteristic of this hemisphere of the brain. Artistry, empathy, inventiveness, big picture thinking. These kinds of abilities have become the ones that matter most. These kinds of abilities have become the first among equals. That's the punchline of what I wanted to say to you today. That's the claim that I'm making here. Now, if you offer up this claim, that we're moving from a world of labor markets built less on the logical linear capabilities and more on the artistic empathic capabilities, you often get a kind of bipolar response. Although looking at your facial expressions here late on a Friday afternoon, the response is decidedly more unipolar. If you say this to a group of artists and designers, they think it's pretty groovy. If you go to a group of engineers, if you go to, say, an engineering school, engineering university, I mean, I've learned this the hard way. Go to a American university engineering department and say, hey, guys, and it was mostly guys, hey, guys, we're moving from a world of logical linear reasoning to one of artistic empathic reasoning. The response among engineers is that they typically will begin text messaging each other. And when I finally had the gumption to see what they were text messaging, I realized they were all text messaging each other a single word. It is an 8-letter word, 2 syllables, begins with B, ends with T, not Buddhist. If you're in that category, all right, or you're text messaging right now, that's cool. I actually want you to be skeptical of this claim. But what I want you to understand is that this claim that I'm making here isn't wishful thinking, isn't how I want the world to be. It is an argument. And the argument produces very bad results for me. Because I myself am a very, 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 very left-brain guy. I'm very analytical. I'm the most sequential person you've ever met in your life. I'm a very quantitative person. I love numbers. I love data. In my hierarchy of loves, my greatest love in life are my wife and our 3 children. My second greatest love in life, and I wish I were joking about this, but I'm absolutely not. My second greatest love in life are charts and graphs. I love charts and graphs. In a kind of unhealthy way, I love charts and graphs. It's kind of how I see the world. But if you do what I've done over the last couple of years and taken this very hard-headed, analytic, left-brain look at the facts, at the evidence, at the data of what's really going on in organizations, in careers, in labor markets, I don't even think it's all that close that the scales are tilting. But I want to lay out this argument to you in the hopes that, given that we have a diverse group of people here, both in terms of nationality and in terms of function, that you can locate yourself in this context and draw some conclusions about what it means for you. So I'm going to make this argument to you. It's a logical, linear, sequential, cause and effect argument. All right? The effect is that the scales are tilting. These abilities, the metaphorical left brain abilities, still matter, but they matter less. And these abilities, the metaphorical right brain abilities, are the ones that matter most. And that's the effect. And there are three causes. Three causes. They are abundance, Asia, and automation. Abundance, Asia, automation. Let's start with abundance because I think it's the most important in business terms. I think it's the least heralded. I think it basically, in some ways, goes completely unremarked upon, even though it's transforming all kinds of businesses, all kinds of careers. And the reason for that has to do with certain kinds of biases. Biases in our brain, biases in our media. What gets a huge amount of attention, both in terms of how we react as individual species, but also in terms of how our institutions react, is bad news that happens fast. Bad news that happens fast gets a huge amount of attention. What gets no attention at all, but is ultimately, in this case, more important, is good news that happens slowly. Good news that happens slowly gets no attention at all. And abundance is a case of good news happening slowly. What I mean by abundance is that the standard of living among middle-class people, deep into the middle class, in many countries in the world, not everywhere, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in much of the EU, in Japan, in Australia, the standard of living among middle-class people is breathtaking by historic standards, breathtaking by international standards. If you look at the standard, your own standard of living, and you contrast that with your grandparents' standard of living, the difference is staggering. Your lives in some fashion, in material terms, would be almost unrecognizable to your grandparents. I think about my grandparents, all of whom were born in the first few years of last century. If you were to take them when they were my age, when they were in their mid-40s, transport them through time to the median family in Newcastle, or the median family in Columbus, Ohio, or the median family in Tokyo, they would be amazed at how that family lives. That family probably owns its own home. That family's probably been on airplanes. That family probably has decent health care. If you look at that family's medicine cabinet, they have an array of medicines that weren't even contemplated back then. Look at that family's mobile phone, which we'll get to more in a moment. As we learned yesterday from Ray Kurzweil, that mobile phone basically has more computing power than existed when my grandparents were my age. Let me drive it home with some data, with some facts. I was on the phone with my wife last night, and she said, when are you coming home, and what are you doing? And I said, I got to go do this thing in Newcastle. I'm in Newcastle, and I got to do this thing, and I'm, at the end of 2 very, very long days, and I'm trying to make this argument about the economy. And she said, all right, Dan, just do me a favor. Whatever you do, all right, just go easy on these folks. Go easy on these folks. For the sake of your own reputation, for the sake of our family, for the sake of international harmony, please, whatever you do, Dan, especially late on a Friday afternoon, whatever you do not whip out one of your room-emptying charts. I said, what do you mean by that? I mean, I'm not an idiot. I would never, I would only show people, especially nice people like you, I would only show you things of beauty like this. Now, this is an amazingly interesting chart. It really is. And it actually goes to some of the other things that we've been talking about over the last couple of days. I'll go easy on you and just sort of walk you through it very, very simply. This axis right here, these are U.S. data. This axis right here is percentage of U.S. households. All right? Percentage of U.S. households. This axis is time. And this is stuff. All right? So let's take a look at this. Here's a telephone. 1915 in America, 30% of homes had telephones. By the time you get to 1975, you hit 90%. Let's take a look at think about my parents here. Refrigerators. refrigerator. When my parents were born, you had basically 10% of American homes had a refrigerator. 10%. You go to early 1960s when I'm born, basically have 100%. Think about a clothes washer. Think about clothes dryer, for instance. When I'm born, you have 20% of American homes have it. Suddenly, you're into the 80%. Now, this is basically sort of the Kurzweil argument right here. Suddenly, these things start popping up, and they hit ubiquity very quickly. So you have a microwave oven. Fewer than 10% of homes have it in, say, 1980. Boom! Now it's 90%. Look at VCRs. VCRs, 1976, 77, basically don't exist. Boom! They're ubiquitous, and then they become obsolete. Take a look at mobile phones. This is an extraordinary thing. 1990 in America, you had maybe 2% of homes had mobile phones. Now you have 87% mobile phone penetration, household mobile phone penetration in the U.S. This is in a country that has a 12% poverty rate. So basically, what it means is that everyone in America who isn't impoverished has a mobile phone. Over and over again, you see this. You see this massive clustering. This massive clustering up here in the plus 90%. Nothing over here isn't, you get a few things up here in the 90%, but right now you have just massive amount of material abundance. This is what I mean. Let me give you an example about mobile phones, since it's a digital conference and we're talking about mobile telephony. Here's the UK. Take a look at that. I mean, this has to do with mobile phone penetration in Europe. Here's the UK, 127%. That's more than a 1-to-1 ratio of mobile phones, a product that basically doesn't exist 20 years ago. Take a look at, take a look at the Czech Republic. Okay, 15 years ago, there wasn't a Czech Republic. Now you have 123% mobile phone penetration. Look at Italy, for God's sake. Look at that, 146%. This is the story of modern economies. I'll give you an example. Another example from the U.S. Take automobiles. When my grandparents were my age, my grandparents who were middle-class people, they didn't have an automobile. An automobile was a luxury item. Automobile was a rich person's toy. My two grandmothers, again, middle-class women, never learned how to drive. And it would be almost unthinkable for a middle-class woman in the UK or the US not to learn how to drive. Why? Because in the US today, we have more automobiles than we have licensed drivers. It's greater than a 1-to-1 ratio between the product and the potential users. This is what I mean by abundance. Let me give you another example of abundance, a vivid example of abundance, a concession to the notion that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Anybody know what that is? Storage. That's right. That's not just any storage. 3196 is my self-storage unit. Now, I'm a left-brain guy, analytical. I also believe in free markets. So if you're a left-brain guy and you believe in free markets, you think that businesses exist to solve problems, right? They exist to meet unmet needs. What's the unmet need that this industry called self-storage is trying to address? Too much stuff. Too much stuff. Now, the very analytical among you, you realize you can't really conclude that it's too much stuff. It could be that over the last 30 years in America and elsewhere in the world, homes have gotten progressively smaller. No. Over the last 30 years, homes have gotten bigger, households have gotten smaller, and yet you have a whole industry devoted to housing people's extra crap. A whole industry. Now, I'm not a history buff, so I'm just going to speculate on this. I haven't looked it over. But in the years after the Great Depression in the U.S., I don't think there was a self-storage industry. In the years after London was bombed in World War II, I don't think there was a self-storage industry. Now you have this industry in the United States. How big is this industry whose sole purpose is to house our extra stuff? It's huge. It's a $22.6 billion a year business. In the United States, the self-storage industry is larger than the motion picture business. This is what I mean by abundance. Now, lest you think this is some kind of peculiar American thing, I point you to some data from the United Kingdom, which says that in the United Kingdom already there's 30 million square feet of self-storage, 300,000 customers, and $410 million of annual revenue. Not exactly as big as the United States, but you can't consign this to a weird American thing. All right, this is what I mean by abundance. A staggering level of material prosperity deep into the middle class in many of the advanced economies. Now, remember I'm making an argument here for the tilt. an argument for the tilt in favor of these kinds of capabilities. In a world of abundance, in a world so saturated with this, in a world, let's go back here, I just like to look at it. In a world that looks like that, okay, where everything is clustered up on that top, plus 90%, you basically have, I'm oversimplifying, but I'm oversimplifying in the name of clarity. That basically yields two strategies for business. You have two business strategies in a world of abundance. Here's the first strategy. What's that? An iPod. How many of you have an iPod? How many of you knew 8 years ago you were missing an iPod? One, yeah. But that's actually, I mean, you laugh a little bit, it's actually a serious question, because in a world of abundance, there's a premium on giving people something they didn't know they were missing. That's the best strategy in a world of abundance, is giving people something they didn't know they were missing. That's always the best strategy. That is not a tinkering strategy. It's a big, bold, inventive strategy. It's very hard to do. It's very hard to do every single day. It's very hard to show up to work on Monday and say, hey, I thought of something else the world didn't know it was missing. Tuesday, oh, something else the world didn't know it was missing. Wednesday, oh, one more thing. It's a very difficult thing to do. If you get one or two of them in a lifetime, you're doing pretty well. So there's a second strategy in a world of abundance, a strategy that we tend to dismiss, a strategy that I think is maybe not as equally innovative, but actually requires a certain amount of innovation, a certain style of thinking to serve customer needs. And that strategy is this. What's that? Toilet brush. What kind of toilet brush? A posh toilet brush, right? How else? Give me another adjective to describe that besides. Designer. Who said that? Designer, no one who will admit it. Designer toilet brush. That's a toilet brush, exactly right. It's a toilet brush designed by Michael Graves, one of the great product designers and architects of our time. A designer toilet brush. Now, I think about my late grandparents. They'd find this peculiar. One of my grandparents, I think, would find this a sign of the apocalypse. But I don't find it peculiar or apocalyptic because I'm a left-brain guy and I look at this analytically. So it makes perfect sense to me. Suppose I leave the noble world of writing business books and go into the toilet brush industry. I go into the toilet brush industry. At the outset, I face a threshold problem. The threshold problem is that we've pretty much solved the engineering side of the toilet brush challenge, right? We can make a toilet brush that scrubs a bowl more or less well. So if you want to sell more toilet brushes, what are your options? Well, your first option is this option right here, the iPod option. You come up with a dramatically more efficacious toilet brush. You make a monumental leap in toilet brush technology. You come up with the iPhone of toilet brushes, say. Hard to do. Hard to do, the best strategy. If you can't do that, then you have a second option. The second option is to take this product, this service, this experience that seems where the utilitarian side is pretty much worked out and infuse it with some right brain elements. Design, look and feel, emotion. That is, even the most ridiculously mundane products, services, and experiences have become objects of desire. This is what happens in a world of abundance. If you think about it the way a designer would think of it, every product, every service, every experience in our midst is a combination of what they would call utility and significance. Utility and significance. Everything that human beings create for other human beings combines utility and significance. Utility, it has to work. Significance, it has to have some other kind of attribute. Everything is a combination of those two things in different proportions. Well, what's happened now is that utility is abundant, the price goes down. Significance is scarce, the price goes up. And if you sort of unpack this, you find this, if you think about this as a combination of utility and significance, well, this is a toilet brush that has maybe $1 worth of material in it that sells for $14. Okay? Selling $1 worth of material for $14, that's a pretty good business, right? Those are what we call margins, right? Are those margins are coming out of significance, not utility. And if you look at that utility-significance divide, you find more and more this has become a significance economy absent a giant leap in utility. So that's how abundance tilts the scales. It gives you two strategies. The iPod strategy, give the world something it didn't know it was missing. The designer toilet brush strategy, take something utilitarian and infuse it with right brain elements. Let's go to the next one. Abundance, Asia, automation. Abundance, Asia, automation. By Asia, I mean people like this. Here are 6 people I met in Mumbai, India not too long ago. They all do work for North American companies. 2 German companies as well. They all do work that you get paid, let's see, maybe no more than £10,000 annually for. They get paid no more than £10,000 annually for work that you get paid maybe £35,000 for in the UK. All right? All of them have degrees in computer science and engineering. Okay, you've all heard about offshoring and outsourcing of white-collar work. Again, we're talking about globalization here nominally. Let me give you the punchline. Offshoring, if you look at the numbers, is massively overstated in the short run. The effect that white-collar offshoring has had on labor markets in places like the UK and the US is relatively modest in the short term. But if offshoring is overhyped in the short run, I actually think it's underhyped in the long run. It's underhyped in the long run. We have not begun to reckon with what this means. And the reason I say it's underhyped in the long run is because I can do math. I want to stack up just a few numbers for you to make this case. Using India as the embodiment of Asia here for a moment, because I've had the good fortune of spending some time there. India has an advantage in the global economy. It's also a liability in many regards, but for this purpose, it's an advantage. India has 1 billion people. 1 billion people. Now, for the handful of you with a kind of liberal arts background, I should point out that 1 billion is a very large number. There's a principle of statistics called the law of large numbers, which states that if you take a small percentage of a large number, you get another large number. The law of large numbers works powerfully in India's favor. Let's say that 15%, 15% of India's population hits this status. Talented, ambitious, upper middle class, able to compete in global labor markets. 15% of 1 billion is 150 million, is routine. 150 million. 150 million. All right, let's put that in some context here. Japan, where I spent some time last year, Japan is the world's second largest economy. 150 million is larger than the population of Japan. The United States has the world's largest economy by far. Last month, the number of people at work in the United States economy, if you add up every single person, public, private, government, whatever, every single person working for pay in the United States, you get to 146 million people. So, if 15% of India's population makes it to this status, 15%, meaning 85% of India gets left behind, you have more talented, ambitious, college-educated, upper-middle-class Indians than you have citizens of the world's second largest economy and workers in the world's largest economy. That's if 85% get left behind. Let me layer on 2 more facts. First, one fact. 2010 is the year that India will be the largest English-speaking country in the world. Not the United States. Not the United States. It's the law of large numbers. Again, India has about 1.2 billion people, actually. If you have 1.2 billion people, you can have 800 million people in your country who don't speak a word of English, and you still get the gold medal. And English has become, for better or worse, the de facto language of the global economy. Now, all of us here, all of us who are American or British or Australian or Canadian, should be breathing a big sigh of relief over that. It confers a mostly undeserved advantage. I'll take it, and I'll take it from my kids, but we should be breathing a big sigh of relief. However, the scales have tilted so that America will no longer be the largest English-speaking country in the world. And this is one of the rare times that I can actually empathize with people in the United Kingdom, because this is what happened 100 years ago to you when an upstart, unworthy nation took the gold medal away from its rightful owner. Now, let's talk about the cost of communication between North America and India. It's free. This is my laptop. On my laptop, I can communicate with India for free, thanks to internet telephony, Skype, Jaja, video conferencing built in. It's free. So let's stack this up. 150 million middle-class people speak perfect English, connected to North America and Western Europe for free. That's a big deal. And here's what it means. This has made one word a death sentence in this economy, and that word is routine. Any work that is routine is disappearing from places like the UK, places like the US. What do I mean by routine work? Routine work is work you can reduce to a script, to a spec sheet, to a formula, to a series of steps that has a right answer. If you can write down the steps and it has a right answer, that kind of work is going and is going to disappear. That kind of work is also the sort of work that our moms and dads told us to do. Certain kinds of accounting is routine. Certain kinds of financial analysis is routine. Certain kinds of programming is routine. Certain kinds of law is routine. If you can write down the steps and it has a right answer, that kind of work is trickling out of advanced economies. Soon we'll be racing out of advanced economies. Now, we've seen this movie before. This is what happened to routine mass production work. Mass production work basically following a set of rules with your body. That kind of work basically no longer gets done in a place like the United Kingdom or a place like the United States. It just races to the cheapest cost provider. This is what's happening with routine white-collar work now. Now, two things here. Number one, if you go back to our metaphor, this is the routine side. This is being offshored, racing to the cheapest cost provider, leaving us to compete with this. The second thing to keep in mind is that if you look at these folks right here, this guy's name is Ritesh. You think Ritesh wants to do routine work for the next 50 years? No, he's doing routine work now, that's for sure. Basic computer programming, bug fixing, fabrication, nothing too exotic. Do you think Ritesh wants to do routine work for the next 50 years? No way. Why? Because routine work is boring. Why else? Because Malaysia might do it for less than Ritesh is doing it. Because Vietnam might do it for less than that. Because the Philippines might do it for less than that. This routine left-brain work now races to wherever in the world it can get done the cheapest. Let's go to the next one. Abundance Asia automation. Abundance Asia automation. Here's the story, it's very simple. Last century, machines replaced our back, our muscle. This century, software is replacing our brains. But what part of the brain can software replace? The artistic, empathic, inventive side? Not yet. Or the logical, linear, sequential, rule-based side. So you now see certain kinds of white-collar functions getting nibbled, and to my mind soon gobbled, by automation. Let me give you a delicious example from law. Okay, this august profession. This profession that's impervious to all of these other kinds of forces. Let me give you an example of how something even like law can be automated. I'll give you an example from the U.S. and then we'll bring it to the UK. Let's say that I live in Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., if you want to get a divorce, an uncontested divorce, and you go to a lawyer for an uncontested divorce, it's going to cost you about $3,000 U.S. But an uncontested divorce isn't very complicated, right? It's uncontested. What does a lawyer in an uncontested divorce actually do? Fills out forms, right? Well, that's a stupid question in some ways, because obviously I have some legal training, and obviously the first thing a lawyer in an uncontested divorce does is try to make it contested. But assuming that he or she can't do that, then you're exactly right. It's filling out forms. It's routine work. We could list all the steps. What happens to routine work? It gets offshored or it gets automated. So now, in America, you have a choice. You can go to that lawyer for $3,000, or you can go to completecase.com for affordable divorce solutions. What happens at completecase.com? You go to the site, you look at what U.S. state you live in, you fill out you check the residency requirements, you click a button. Click, you get the form, you fill out the form yourself. Click. They send it to a lawyer to basically look it over so they don't get hit with a charge with unauthorized practice of law. The lawyer looks it over, he blesses it, I bless thee. They send it off to the courthouse, and you've got yourself a divorce, not for $3,000 US, or $2,500 US, or $2,000 US, or $1,000 US, or $500 US, but for $199 US. It's an alarming number of pens just began to move. I just want to say that this one is only in the U.S. right now. But you're right, it's a very good deal. It's a very good deal, except if you're the lawyer doing that routine work, because you've got a competitor coming in charging 90+% less. Now, there are a number of these kinds of options. Here's another one called three-step divorce. See that? Answer questions, print docs, file. It's routine work. So the routine work just races to the bottom. We think of law, or at least I was when I was trained as a lawyer, I was sort of led to believe that law was some kind of august profession, that it was more than simply a vocation. It was like you're an officer of the court. It has this almost regal, august way of thinking of itself. Now, look how they talk about law. Here's another place in America that will do an uncontested divorce for you. 123divorceme.com. All right, it's almost a mockery of the profession. Now, lest you think this is another peculiar American thing, I point you to Mr. Mark Keenan. And I encourage you, for those of you who apparently were shopping just before, to go to divorce-online.co.uk, where instead of saying, it has a more kind of quintessentially British tagline, because it says here, if you go to the site, it says, "Sadly, not all marriages last." You can get a divorce. I think it's the elementary divorce. You can get it for £69 rather than go to a solicitor. You see it with tax preparation in the U.S. Last year, Americans freaked out because there were 1 million U.S. tax returns done in India, because an Indian chartered accountant, an Indian CPA, makes about $500 a month. No way to compete with that. And no way. I mean, a chartered accountant in India makes $500 U.S. a month. You just can't compete with that if you're an American. People went nuts over that. No one says a word, though, about this thing here called TurboTax. 21 million Americans did their taxes on a piece of software, $29 piece of software. Also available in Canada. Even in Australia, there's a service called yourdiagnosis.com that routinizes medical diagnosis. So if you stack this up, abundance, Asia, automation, it's tilting the scales, making these left brain abilities necessary but not sufficient, these right brain abilities the first among equals. In this world, you have to ask yourself 3 questions, 3 very hard-headed questions. You need to look at what you're doing and ask yourself 3 questions. Can someone overseas do it cheaper? Can a computer do it faster? And is what you're selling in demand in an age of abundance? That's the whole thing right there. And the abilities that we've framed much of advanced economies around don't fully answer those questions. Those left brain abilities still matter, but they matter less. The right brain abilities are the ones among equals. What we tend to obsess over high tech, and high tech is still important, but what really matters are abilities that are high concept and high touch. Hard to outsource, hard to automate, and that deliver significance along with utility. Hard to send overseas, hard to reduce to lines of code, and that satisfy one of these 2 strategies of an abundant age. Let me show you just 2 more quick things, and then we'll wrap up. I'm going to show you one more room emptying chart. This is a truly room emptying chart right here. It basically reduces the economy to this simple formulation. This axis here is affluence, globalization, and technology, and this axis is time. Okay, we started out as farmers here. Here's the agriculture age. What happens? People get richer, so they want things beyond food. Globalization takes hold, so we can import food more cheaply from other places. Technology improves. This is a big one for agriculture. And we can crank out more food with fewer people. Those forces gather enough steam, boom, move us into the industrial age, the age of factory workers. All right, what happens? Same thing happens again. We get richer, so we want things beyond mass-produced goods. Globalization takes hold, so we can import mass-produced goods more cheaply from elsewhere. Technology improves, so we can crank out more stuff in factories with fewer people. Those forces gather enough steam, boom, move us into the information age, the age of what Peter Drucker famously called knowledge workers. Well, what happens? It's the same thing. It's like a friggin' movie sequel, right? You know, Rocky 1, Rocky 2, Rocky 3. The same thing happens again. We get richer, so we want things beyond basic information and routine services. We want designer toilet brushes. We want massages. We want iPods. Technology improves, so we can do information work faster with fewer people. And globalization takes hold, and we can essentially import that knowledge work from places like India. Those forces gather enough steam, boom, move us into what we're in now, the conceptual age, the age of creators and empathizers, the age of people who are creators and empathizers. This is the era that we're living in, and it calls on a very different suite of abilities. Now, let me show you. My wife hates this chart, and she said that it completely undermines your theory about the move toward right-brainness because it's the most kind of pathologically left-brain chart you could ever render. And so my team of advisors have implored me to do something else, and so we finally figured out a way to render this evolution of work in a more right-brain way, which is this. All right, we started out as primates, then we became farmers. Okay, now I know some of you are going to argue I'm skipping some history right in here. Factory workers, knowledge workers, and now creators and empathizers. Let me wrap up by saying just a few quick things. In this world, I think there are 6 abilities that I think matter most. They are design, story, symphony, empathy, play, and meaning. We can talk more about them in Q&A. I want to close on this. For someone like me, it's somewhat daunting news to say that these kinds of abilities, things like design, things like story, things like empathy, because they're hard to outsource and hard to automate, because they deliver on these new demands out of an abundant age, that these abilities are the ones that matter most. I find this somewhat daunting because I'm not particularly good at these things. But I think we should, I want to say fear not, but I should say fear less. Because I think that these abilities here are fundamentally human abilities, that they're part of what it means to be human, and that for some of us, they're like muscles that have atrophied, and we just need to work them back into shape. And I want to give you one example of the potential I think all of us have. I decided to test this proposition myself by learning how to draw. As we're moving to this more world that prizes more right brain abilities, I have very little in the way of artistic capabilities. I'm going to learn how to draw. So I took a 5-day drawing course in New York City called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, based on a famous book by that name, taught by the author of that book's son, Brian Baumeister. On day 1, Brian says, Dan, draw your self-portrait. And here it is. Now, that's not very good, right? Take a look at that if you can bear it. All right, what do you think of the eyebrows, for instance? Oops, there are none. What about the neck? Oops, there is none. I'm not, as you discovered over the last half hour, a very exciting guy, but I'm not literally two-dimensional. There's no depth there. Take a look at those lips. No one's lips really look like that. I basically popped in a symbol of lips. I might as well have just written L-I-P-S. Take a look at my eyes, not up there, and my eyes in my real head. My eyes are halfway between the top of my head and the bottom of my chin, right? They were a half hour ago, so I hope that they still are. Where are my eyes here? My eyes are up in my forehead because my nostrils have colonized the middle of my face. So Brian says to me, Dan, the reason you can't draw is because you can't see. You're not seeing anything. You're drawing remembered symbols. You're not seeing anything. You're essentially writing your face. You're drawing out of the left side of your brain. So over the next few days, he started teaching me about things I never knew about, never thought about before. Light and shadow. Never noticed it before. Proportions. Everything is physically proportional to everything else. Relationships. Everything stands in a physical relationship to everything else. Negative space. The space between space. So if you look at this thing right here, that triangle in the A, that's negative space. You look at this kind of gray D in the middle of this green D. That's negative space. I never heard. There's space between space? No one ever told me that. How cool is that? No one ever said anything. Scales are falling off of my eyes. What an interesting world we live in now that I can actually see it. On day 5, Brian says, Dan, draw your self-portrait. And here it is. Now, that's not great. Okay, that's not great. And I've got this kind of weird cubist thing going on here. But let's pretend we're at the ophthalmologist. All right? Better 1 or 2? Better 1 or 2? So I feel like if someone like me can make this kind of progress in such a short time, there's really unliberated symphonic right brain capacity in all of us if we just call these kinds of abilities out of hiding. So on that, I'll wrap up. Declan.